So in many ways, the specific architectural form of this building and the orders of which it's made speak to the memory of this place and embody and concretize those memories. But it's also about the materials of which it's made that contributes to this narrative and makes it even richer and more meaningful. So now we're going to talk about the stuff of which this building is made and some of the specific choices Bramante made about how he articulated it. The word that we want to use, and I'm going to use in a few different ways, is spolia or spoliae. Spolia is a remains, effectively. If you like, it's like our word spoils. So like the spoils of war, for example. But in a lot of ways, in Rome, in the Renaissance, it meant those surviving fragments of antiquity that were used in the building of new buildings. Sometimes they were just pieces, bits and bobs that were inserted into a wall somewhat randomly. But in many ways, they rebuilt buildings of the Renaissance out of the pieces of ancient buildings. The most literal and obvious way they often did that was simply reusing columns. Now, they often didn't have whole columns to reuse, and sometimes they provided new capitals just for the change of the order. In this particular case, Bramante has salvaged all of the column shafts. They're all granite. He probably would have believed that they had come from Egypt, as a lot of granite did in the ancient world. But in fact, these, now we know, are actually from Asia Minor. But imagine that Bramante is thinking that they're Egyptian, so they bring all that baggage of ancient Egypt with them. So he's got shafts that he's recovered from some other source somewhere, some other ancient site in the city, or potentially even someplace as far afield as Hadrian's Villa out towards Tivoli. But he wants to make them Doric. And they probably weren't Doric originally because they're too tall to be Doric. They're too vertical, too attenuated in proportion. Remember when we talked about the introduction to the classical orders, they each have their appropriate proportion. Classically for the Renaissance, Tuscan is 7:1, Doric is 8:1. These are getting closer to 9:1. So they probably came from an order maybe like Ionic. But in any event, Bramante wants to think of them as Doric. He may also want to think of them, though, as Tuscan or Etruscan. Now, when Vitruvius described the Doric order, he's essentially describing a Greek Doric order. And Greek Doric columns had one thing that these columns do not, which is that they had flutes, but they also did not have bases as these columns do. Now, for Vitruvius, Tuscan columns have those things. Tuscan columns have smooth shafts, and they have bases. So perhaps Bramante is also thinking that this is a bit Etruscan, a bit of a Tuscan order, or a mixed Tuscan and Doric order. And that would make sense because we're up here on the Tuscan hill, the hill of Janus across the Tiber from the center city of Rome. So we've got these shafts. He has new capitals and bases carved for them. And then he's got the entablature, which is all newly made, with its correct triglyphs and his metopes that speak to ecclesiastical symbols or Eucharistic symbols. And then we have this issue of the size of this thing. As we talked about at the beginning, it's an interesting building that hovers between being almost like a model of a building and a real building that we can actually inhabit. But as I said, we can in fact inhabit it. It's a chapel. We're meant to go inside. Architecture can be sort of scaled up and scaled down. The thing about the classical language is it's all about proportion. It's not really about size. So you can make a Doric temple very small or very big, and essentially the proportions remain the same. At some level or another, Bramante is a little bit constrained by the size of the cortile, but he wants to make this thing also very much a kind of a marker, and rather small in size. And for a specific reason, again, a particular size that we'll talk about later. Given, though, that it has this particular size that he's given it, he has this problem. We don't scale up and down. We have a particular size. People are the size that they are. And we have to do things like be able to walk through doors. So, as we talked about with this peripteral colonnade, as it gets closer to the center, the space between the columns, or at the wall, the space between the pilasters, gets smaller. That means it's getting rather tight for us to get in there. Bramante could have just simply cut a hole in the wall and allowed us to pass through that wall into the chapel. But he doesn't, and this is what I think is so interesting. And in many ways, it's often talked about as if it's a critique, it's a mistake of Bramante's, like he forgot the fact that we have to walk into this building and he needs to provide a door surround. Because the strange thing about the door surround is it doesn't happen between the pilasters, it overlaps them, chops into them if you like. So it's almost as if it was like an afterthought or a retrofit, that somehow, oh boy, we need a door, so let's not only carve a door in here, but let's put a fancy surround around it and eat up the pilasters. I actually think that's not an accident, that's not an oversight. He didn't just sort of realized that that needed to happen. I think he did it for a specific reason. And the reason I think that is because he made it in a very particular way out of very particular materials. So when you look up at the brackets that are on either side of the door surround supporting its cornice, you have the scroll bracket, and then you have a rectangular block on the back. The rectangular block suggests that this thing came from somewhere else. And the way brackets are inserted into masonry walls is that rectangular bit would have been embedded in the thickness of the wall. It's would have essentially would have kept the bracket in place on the wall. Bramante specifically pulls it out so that we see that bit that was supposed to be hidden. And he's essentially telling us, this is a spolia. This is a fragment of something. This is cobbled together from other pieces that I've brought here or that I've found here potentially. So it's an ancient fragment that he's revealed to us as a fragment. He could have very easily embedded those brackets into the wall, but he didn't. He showed them to us. And that suggests he thinks of this thing as having been cobbled together, made up out of ancient bits. The reason I think that he did that is, again, not for aesthetics, but because he thinks it contributes to the meaning of this thing. Even though in his own day, people would have known the architect Donato Bramante from the Marche, who used to be in Milan, designed this building in 1502, which is the date on the inscription at the foundation of this building. In the future, as Bramante's thinking like Janus towards the future, people may forget when this thing was built. And he may want them to think that in fact it is an ancient building. Maybe an ancient temple that had been transformed into this Christian marker. And so he does a number of things to this to suggest that this building has undergone transformation, even though he's the architect, he made it this way, and it was all built in a fairly short period of time, within a few years. So the fact that he's exposed those spoliae up there suggests to us that maybe the door surround was supposed to have been understood as something that came later, that it was added, that it was somewhat of an afterthought. Maybe when it was sort of mythically transformed from a pagan temple into a Christian temple. And as the pagan temple is not entered by the worshiper, but the worshiper remains outside and the cult figure is retained inside, here the Christian worshiper does go inside. It's an assembly place, even if it's incredibly tiny inside. It's meant to be a place for an assembly of the Mass. So he's shown us that this thing is, it's meant to be awkward. The fact that the door surround chops into the pilasters, or if you like, is overlaid on them, is meant to suggest that it existed and it happened at a particular time. It's not part of the original building. It's been part of its mythical transformation. He's given it a kind of imaginary history, if you like. It wasn't, in his mind, all built at one time. It happened over time. Now, there are other ways in which he makes some specific choices that suggest that's also a strategy, that he's doing that deliberately. If we look at the steps, for example, we're sitting on 3 steps, and then there is this sort of raised portion with another 3 steps set into it. And that raised portion is a kind of, if you like, a podium upon which the temple is set. And it's, in a way, also like a parapet or a balustrade that the columns sit upon. And it has a molding down below and a molding at top. And that molding wraps around, and makes the very top step as we step into the chapel. That's a very elegantly designed detail. It's a very thoughtful detail. He would have had to make drawings and explain that to the stonemason. When he gets to the side, at the cross-access doors, the steps look as if they've been chopped into the existing crepidoma or the existing base of steps here, as if they were an afterthought, like the side doors were later, that maybe there was an original simple entry here for the cult statue, and then later doors were cut into this thing to connect it to the church and to make it a Christian church. As we talked about, the priest who would have served this church would have probably vested in the sacristy here and processed through one of the side chapels in here into the chapel to celebrate the Mass. So that again is a kind of second layer to this thing, an afterthought, if you like, a later transformation of the building. And if anybody is capable, like he is, of detailing this way, if he thought that detail there was meant to be original, he could have detailed it in an equivalently elegant way. But he didn't. It's almost crude the way it's realized. And the doors themselves are almost crude. They really are, like this door could have been, just chopped into the wall. They fit just between the pilasters. So we don't need to be bigger than the pilasters to get into this thing. We can fit into this thing between the pilasters. They're not that small. So the fact that we can get in there that way without disturbing the pilasters suggests we could have done that here too. But he chose not to. He chose to accentuate the fact that there's this conflict between our entry and the perfect ordering system of the outside. And again, here with the steps that are chopped in, again, it suggests that that cross-axis is a later development of the building, as if the building had a history of its own. So in a lot of ways, the whole building is a kind of spolia, a survivor, a transformed ancient building rendered new for this modern Renaissance and Christian function. And in that sense, Bramante's thinking in terms of an almost Janus-like understanding of time, looking both backwards and forwards, and thinking of this building as existing in time, in dialogue with the past, and moving towards the future, providing a model for the future for other architects, but also suggesting how the past could be transformed, suggesting a model process by which we can make new buildings. We should go inside or think about the inside a little bit just to see what happens inside. Outside we have 16 columns, 16 pilasters. Inside, because it's smaller again, we're going to keep the door and the door on the cross-axis. We get windows on the diagonal axes, and then we're going to get only 8 pilasters. And he's going to move them a little bit, cluster them around the openings to enframe the openings, so that the system changes at the wall. As soon as we pass through the threshold of the door, we're in a different realm. You'll also notice inside that there's what's called a cosmati floor, or a cosmatesque floor. The Cosmati were a family in medieval Rome who made floors for many churches of medieval Rome out of fragments, bits and pieces of old buildings, pieces of porphyry and green stones and various kinds of stones that they would arrange in geometric patterns. But because they were basically chips and fragments, little triangles and squares and circles, they arranged them in elaborate patterns to make that sort of necessity a virtue. The fact that they were dealing with bits and bobs and little chips and bits that have fallen off of buildings, they made something beautiful out of them. And that was already by Bramante's time an old way of making church floors. And he uses that way here, again, in the chapel to suggest this building may be older than of his time. Maybe it got its floor, in fact, in the Middle Ages, not in his own day. It's a very sort of old-style way of doing a floor. And again, that would have been attuned, something people of his time would have been attuned to, would have perceived and been able to read.